Welcome to the Biota.org Interviews podcast. This is part of the special series taken from the audio of the Biota 2 conference. Today's speaker is the late Douglas Adams.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now, this is originally billed as a debate, only because I was a bit anxious coming here because I didn't think I was going to have time to prepare anything. And also, it's such a sort of room full of luminaries. I thought, what can I possibly have to say? So I'll just sort of settle for debate. But actually, after having been here for a couple of days and realising it's a bunch of guys, and it's been it's been so sort of rife with ideas, and I've had so many ideas from talking to people or listening to people. I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll stand up and have a debate with myself and argue with myself. And so I shall talk for a while and then hope to sufficiently provoke and inflame opinion that there will be an outburst of chair throwing at the end of it, and we can all sort of take off. So I've decided, first of all, before I sort of embark on what I want to say, which may get a little bit sort of lost from time to time because there's a lot of stuff that's just sort of come in from what we've been hearing today. So if I occasionally sort of go like that, I think I was telling somebody earlier today. I have a 4-year-old daughter, and I'm very, very interested watching her when she was, just on the sort of first 2 or 3 weeks of life, and sort of smiling face. And every now and then. And you suddenly realise, nobody would have spotted this in previous ages, she's rebooting. Anyway, so before I embark on what I want to try and tackle, I just want to mention one thing which is completely meaningless, but I'm terribly proud of it. I was born in Cambridge in 1952. And my initials are DNA. Now, the topic I want to introduce to you this evening, the subject of the debate that we're about to sort of have, is a slightly facetious one. You'll be surprised to hear, but we'll see where we go with it. Which is there an artificial God? Now, I am, as I'm sure many of you will know, and I'm sure most of the people in this room will probably share the same view, a thoroughgoing, out-and-out atheist. On the other hand, one can't help noticing the idea of God has had an enormously profound impact on human history and over many, many centuries. And it's very interesting to sort of figure out where this came from, what it means, and what in a modern scientific world, such as we all kind of hope, sometimes against hope, that we live in, what this actually means. I was thinking of it actually earlier today when Larry Yeager was talking about what is life and what's the definition of life, and then happened to mention at the end what I didn't know, which is a special field of learning, handwriting recognition. And the following sort of strange thought went through my mind, which is that trying to figure out what is life and what isn't and where the boundary is has an interesting relationship with how you recognise handwriting. Now, we all have we all kind of instinctively know when presented with any particular entity, whether it's a bit of mould in the fridge or whether it's or whatever. You kind of instinctively know when something is an example of life and when it isn't. But it turns out to be tremendously hard to say exactly what to define it. I remember a long time ago, for some speech I was giving, needing a definition of life, and assuming it was a simple one, and sort of polled people around the internet. I was astonished to discover how diverse the definitions were, and how very, very not only diverse, but how detailed each one had to be in order to include this and not include that and include this and that. But if you think about it, anything that includes a fruit fly and Richard Dawkins and the Great Barrier Reef is an awkward set of objects to try and understand. So when we try and figure out what is alive and what isn't, we try and find what are the rules we're looking for. We're trying to find a rule that is self-evidently true. And it turns out to be very, very hard. Now you compare this with the business of recognizing whether something is an A or a B or a C in the handwriting recognition. Now, there's a similar kind of process, but there's also a very, very, very different process. Because you may say of something that's that you're not quite certain whether it counts as life or not life. Well, it's kind of there on the edge, isn't it? It's probably a very sort of low example of what you might call alive. It probably is just about alive, or maybe it isn't just about alive. Or maybe you might say about something that's an example of digital life. Well, does that count as being alive? You know, it isn't something, in somebody's marvelous phrase earlier, something will go squish if you step on it. Think about the controversial, Gaia hypothesis. People say, well, is the planet alive? Is the ecosphere alive or not? It depends on in the end on how you define something. Now, you compare that with handwriting recognition, and in the end, you're trying to say, well, is this an A or is it a B? And people write A's or B's in all kinds of different ways, either floridly or sloppily or whatever. But in the end, it's no good saying, well, it's sort of A-ish, but there's a bit of B in there. Because you can't spell the word apple with such a thing. It is either A or B. And how do you judge in the end? If you're doing handwriting recognition, in the end what you're trying to do is not trying to assess the relative degrees of A-ness or B-ness of this letter. You're actually trying to divine the intention of the person who wrote it. And it's very clear in the end. Is it an A or B? No, it's an A because the person writing it was writing the word apple, and that's where the word A. So that's clearly what it meant. So, in the absence of any intentional creator, in the end you cannot say what life is, because it simply depends on what set of definitions you include in your overall definition. So, without a God, life is only a matter of opinion. I just want to go around sort of picking up a few other things that sort of came around today. I was fascinated by was it Larry again talking about tautology? Because there's an argument you come across from people who are trying to sort of say, yeah, evolution, don't quite buy it, which says, and I remember being stumped by this once when somebody, because I was stumped, I couldn't come up with a reply because I was so puzzled by the challenge and couldn't quite figure it out. And the guy said to me, yes, but the whole theory of evolution is based on a tautology. Saying that which survives is tautological, therefore doesn't mean anything. And so I thought about that for a bit. And it finally occurred to me that a tautology is something that, if it means nothing, means that not only has no information gone into it, but no consequences come out of it. But here is something that is no information needs to go into because it is self-evident. But a huge amount of consequences come out of it. So we may have accidentally stumbled upon the ultimate answer. I mean, it is the only thing, it's the only powerful force, and arguably the most powerful force of which we are aware, which requires no other input and requires no other support from any other place. It is self-evident, hence tautological, but nevertheless astonishingly powerful in its effects. So it's hard to find anything that corresponds to that. And I put it at the beginning of one of my books. I sort of reduced it to what I thought was very central, which was actually very similar to one you counted earlier, which was anything that happens. Anything that is happening causes something else to happen, causes something else to happen. And anything that is happening causes itself to happen again, happens again. And And in fact, you don't even need the second two, because they flow from the first one, which is self-evident. And there's nothing else you need to say. Everything else flows from that. So I think we actually have in our grasp here a fundamental, ultimate truth, to which there is no gainsaying. And it was spotted by the guy who said, this is a tautology. Yes, it is, but it's a unique tautology in that it requires no information to go out, but an infinite amount of information comes out of it. So I think that is, arguably, therefore, the sort of prime cause of everything in the universe. Big claim. But I feel I'm talking to a sympathetic audience. Where does the idea of God come from? Well, I think we have a very skewed point of view on an awful lot of things. But let's try and see where our point of view comes from. Imagine early man. And early man is an evolved creature. And he finds himself in a world that he's begun to take a little bit of charge of. He's begun to be a toolmaker. He's begun to be a changer of his environment and the tools that he's made. And he makes tools when he does in order to make changes in his environment, to make them. I'll give you an example of the way that man operates as opposed to other animals. As we know, speciation tends to occur when a small group of animals gets separated from the rest of a herd by some geological upheaval or population pressure or food shortage or whatever it is, finds itself in a new environment, and maybe something different is going on here. Let's take a very simple example. Maybe a bunch of animals suddenly find itself in a place where the weather is rather colder. And we know that in a few generations, those genes that favour a thicker coat will have come to the fore, and you'll come and you'll find the animals now got a thicker coat. Now, man, who is a toolmaker, doesn't have to do this. He can inhabit an extraordinary wide range of habitats on Earth, from a tundra to the Gobi Desert. You can imagine living in New York, by the way. And the reason is this: when he arrives in a new environment, he doesn't then have to sort of wait for several generations. If this arrives, say, in a cold environment, for those genes which favour a thicker coat to come to the fore. He sees an animal that's already got a thicker coat and says, "I'll have it off him." Because tools have enabled us to think intentionally and to make things and to do things and to create a world that fits us better. Now, imagine an early man sort of surveying his surroundings at the end of a happy day doing whatever he's been doing. And he looks around himself and he sees a world which pleases him mightily. And behind him are the sort of mountains with caves in them. Mountains are great because you can go and hide in there. You're in the caves and you're out of the rain and the bears can't get you, so mountains are great. In front of you there's the sort of forest which has got nuts and berries with great food, it's delicious, and there's a stream going by which is full of water, and water's delicious to drink, and you can do all sorts of stuff with it. You can float your boat in water, you can do whatever you like with water. And here's cousin Ugg, and he's just caught a mammoth, and mammoths are great. Mammoths are fabulous. You can eat them. You can wear their coats. You can take their bones to create weapons to catch other mammoths. I mean, this is a great world. I mean, this is fantastic. So, but he's got a moment to reflect, and he's thinking, well, this is an interesting world that I find myself in. And he then asks himself a very treacherous question. And it's a question which is actually completely meaningless and fallacious, but only comes about because of the nature of the sort of person he is, the sort of person he has evolved into, and the sort of person who has thrived because he thinks this particular way. So man, the maker, looks at his world and says, so who made this then? Who made this? You can see why it's a treacherous question. And he thinks, well, because there's only one sort of being he knows who makes things, he thinks, well, therefore must necessarily be a much bigger, much more powerful, and necessarily invisible one of me. And because I tend to be the strong one who does all this stuff, he's probably male. And so we have the idea of a god. And then, because when we make things, we do things with the intention of doing something with them. He asks himself this question, which is, well, if he made it, what did he make it for? Now the real trap springs, because now this has been thinking, well, this world fits me very well. Here are all these things that support me and feed me and look after me. The world fits me very well. He has an inescapable conclusion, which is that whoever made it for him, which is rather like, if you imagine a puddle waking up one morning. I know this doesn't often happen, but I'm allowed to have puddles waking up. And a puddle wakes up one morning and thinks, oh, this is an interesting world I find myself in. It's an interesting hole I seem to be inhabiting. It fits me rather neatly, doesn't it? In fact, it fits me staggeringly neatly. It must have been made to have me in it. And this is such a powerful idea that as the sun rises in the sky, and gradually the air heats up, and gradually the puff is getting smaller and smaller, he's still frantically hanging on to the notion that everything's going to be all right. Because this world was meant to have him in it, it was built to have him in it. So the moment at which he disappears kind of catches him a little bit by surprise. I think this may be something we need to be on the watch out for. It's funny, I mean, it's curious. We all know that at some point in the future, the universe will come to an end. And at some point, considerably in advance from that, but still not immediately pressing, the sun will explode. Now, we feel there's plenty of time to worry about that, isn't there? On the other hand, that's a very dangerous thing to say. I mean, look at what's supposed to be going to happen on the 1st of January 2000. Let's not pretend we didn't have warning that the century was going to end. I think we need to take a sort of larger perspective on who we are and what we're doing here if we're going to sort of survive in the long term. So we have all kinds of sort of odd things in the perspective of which we see the world. I mean, the fact that we live at the bottom of a deep gravity well on the surface of a gas-covered planet going around a nuclear fireball 90 million miles away and think this is normal is obviously some sort of indication of how skewed our perspective tends to be. But we have done various things over the intellectual history to kind of slowly correct some of our misapprehensions. And oddly enough, an awful lot of these have come from sand. So let's talk about the 4 ages of sand. Now, from sand, we make glass. And from glass, we make lenses, we make telescopes. So, at some point, the great early astronomers, Copernicus, Galileo, turned their telescopes on the heavens, and discovered that the world, the universe, suddenly, was an astonishingly different place than we expected. So far from the world being most of the universe, with a few little sort of bright lights going around it, it turns out, and this takes a long, long, long time to sink in, we are one tiny little speck going, as I say, around a little sort of nuclear fireball, which is one of millions and millions and millions and millions that make up this particular galaxy. And our galaxy in turn is one of millions or billions that make up the universe, and now we're also faced with the possibility of maybe billions of universes. So that has had a little bit of a sort of corrective on our perspective that the universe was ours and it's I rather love the notion that I was discussing this with somebody earlier today, and we were talking about there's a book I thoroughly enjoyed recently by David Deutsch, who is an advocate of the sort of multiple universes view of the universe, called The Fabric of Reality, in which he explains, this is sorry, this is a big sidebar here I'm going off of, in which he explains that I felt very, very powerfully the notion of the quantum multiple universe view of the universe, and this came from the famous wave-particle dichotomy about the behaviour of light. That you can measure light as a wave, and it behaves as a wave. You measure it as a particle, and it behaves as a particle. How does this come to be? And David Deutsch points out that if you imagine that our universe is simply one layer, and there is an infinite multiplicity of universes spreading out from outside, then not only does it solve the problem simply goes away. I mean, this is exactly how you expect light to behave under those circumstances. Quantum mechanics has kind of been predicated on the notion that the universe behaves as if there was a multiplicity of universes, but it rather strains our credulity to think there actually would be. Now, this actually goes straight back to Galileo and the Vatican, doesn't it? Because, in fact, what the Vatican said to Galileo was, we don't dispute your readings, we just dispute the explanation you put on them. So it's all very well for you to say that the planets sort of do that as they go round, and that it is as if we were a planet and those planets were all going around the sun. It's all right to say it's as if that's happening, but you're not allowed to say that that is what is happening, because we have obviously a sort of total lockhole on universal truth. And also, it simply strains personal credulity. So I think that the idea that there are multiple universes currently strains our credulity. But it may just be that it's just one more string to learn to live with, because we've had to learn to live with a whole bunch of them in the past. Okay, so that was the macroscopic view of the universe, if you like, that came from the first age of sand, the macroscopic view of the universe. Well, the other thing, that, of course, that comes out of that vision of the universe is that it turns out to be composed almost entirely, rather worryingly, of nothing. Wherever you look, there is nothing. Every now and then you come across a tiny, tiny little speck of rock or light or whatever, but otherwise it's kind of just nothing out there. But nevertheless, we've actually kind of, by watching the way all these tiny little specks behave in the vast nothingness, we begin to divine certain principles, certain laws, gravity, and so on and so forth. Then the next stage of science is the microscopic one. We put glass lenses into microscopes, and we suddenly look at the microscopic view of the universe, and we begin to understand, again, a rather worrying thing when we get down to the sort of atomic level, that the solid world we all live in also consists, rather worryingly, of almost nothing. And even where we do find something, it turns out not to be actually something, but the probability that there may be something there. So this is a deeply misleading universe in one way or other. And wherever we look, it's beginning to be extremely alarming and extremely upsetting to our sense of who we are, that we're sort of great strapping physical people living in a universe that consists almost entirely of us. Just isn't the case. So again, but at this point we are still divining from this all sorts of fundamental principles. We're recognizing the way that gravity works, the strong and weak nuclear force work. We're recognizing the nature of matter, the nature of particles, and so on. But having got those fundamentals, we're still not very good at figuring out how it works, because the maths of trying to figure out how it works is kind of rather tricky. So we tend to come up with an almost sort of clockwork view of the way it all works together, because that's the best that our math can sort of manage. And I guess and I don't mean in any way to disparage Newton, because I mean I guess he was the first person who saw that there were principles at work that were different than anything we actually saw around us. So his laws of motion, that something will remain in its position of either rest or motion until some other force works on it. It's something that none of us living in a gravity well, in a gas envelope, had ever seen, because everything we move comes to a halt. And it was only through very, very careful watching and observation and measuring and divining principles underlying what we could all actually see happening that he actually came up with the principles that we all now recognise as laws of motion and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, it is, by modern terms, a somewhat clockwork view of the universe. And as I say, I don't mean that to sound disparaging in any way at all, because his achievements, as we all know, were absolutely monumental. But it still kind of doesn't make sense to us. Now, there are all sorts of entities we're also aware of, as well as, particles, forces, tables and chairs and rocks and so on, that are almost invisible to science. Almost invisible, because science has almost got nothing to say about them whatsoever. And I'm talking about sort of dogs and cats and cows and each other. We are so far, living things are so far beyond the purview of anything that science can actually say anything about at that time, that we don't even sort of recognize them as almost as things that science might be expected to have something to say about. So the early days of zoology is purely a descriptive science. So you almost imagine, I like to imagine sort of Newton sort of sitting down sort of working out laws of motion, and thinking he's sort of figuring out the way the universe works. And here's this cat wandering around. Shoo, get out of here. I have nothing to do with it. And the reason we had no idea how cats worked was because we had always proceeded since Newton by the very simple principle, in fact it was a little bit glib, I mean, essentially we have worked by taking things apart to see how they work. And one of the things, if you try and take a cat apart to see how it works, the first thing you have in your hand is a non-working cat. So it almost lies outside our vision. This is a level of complexity that is so far beyond anything we have any means of understanding. We just think of it as a different class of object, a different class of matter. This is life. This is something that has this mysterious essence in it, and it's God-given. It's the only explanation we've got. Then, bombshell comes in 1859 when Darwin published his The Origin of Species. Takes a long time before we really sort of get to grips with this and begin to understand it, because not only does it seem incredible and thoroughly demeaning to us, there is yet another shock to our system to discover not only are we not the centre of the universe and we're not made of anything, but we started out as some kind of slime and got to where we are via being a monkey. It just doesn't read well. Hang on a minute. But also, we have no opportunity to see this stuff at work. So in a sense, Darwin was like Newton in that he was the first person to see underlying principles that really were not at all obvious from the everyday world in which we lived, and you had to think very hard and to understand the nature of what was happening around you. And we have no clear, obvious, everyday examples of evolution to point to. And even today, that persists as a slightly tricky problem if you're trying to persuade somebody who doesn't buy all this evolution stuff. So we'll show you an example. It's actually, they're hard to find in terms of everyday observation. So then comes along the third age of sand. And the third age of sand, we've discovered something else you can make out of sand, which is silicon, silicon chip. And suddenly what opens up to us is a world, is a universe not of particles, fundamental particles and fundamental forces, but the things that were missing in that picture that told us how they work, i.e. what the silicon chip revealed to us was the process that makes it work. The silicon chip, which enables us to do mathematics tremendously fast, to model, as it turns out, the very, very simple processes that are analogous to those that happen in evolution, analogous in terms of their simplicity, iteration, looping, branching, the feedback loop. The feedback loop, which lies at the heart of everything you do on a computer and lies at the heart of everything that happens in evolution, i.e. the output stage of one generation becomes the input stage for the next. And suddenly, we have a working model. I mean, not for a while, because early machines are terribly sort of slow and funky. But gradually we discover we've got a working model of this thing that previously we could only guess at or deduce, and you had to be pretty sharp and pretty clear thinker even to divine it happening when it was far from obvious and indeed counterintuitive, particularly to as a proud species as we are. So the computer forms a third age of perspective, if you like, because suddenly it enables us to see how life works. Now that is an extraordinarily important point, because it becomes self-evident that life, that all forms of complexity do not flow downwards, they flow upwards. And there's a whole grammar that anybody who is now used to using computers is now familiar with, which means that evolution is no longer a puzzle, it's no longer a peculiar thing, because anybody who's ever looked at the way a computer program works, that from very, very simple iterative pieces of code, each line of which is tremendously simple, give rise to enormously complex phenomena in a computer. By enormously complex phenomena, I mean a word processing program just as much as I mean Sierra or creatures. It is very, very counterintuitive. I mean, I can remember the first time I ever read a programming manual, many, many years ago. I first started to encounter computers about 1983, and I thought, well, I want to learn a little bit more about it, so I learned something about programming. I picked up C manual. And I read through the sort of first 2 or 3 chapters of this book, which took me about a week. And at the end, it said, congratulations, you've now written the letter A on the screen. And I thought, well, I must have misunderstood something there, because that was a huge, huge amount of work to do that. What if I want to now write another letter? Because the process of programming, the speed and the means by which enormous simplicity gives rise to enormously complex results was not part of my mental grammar at that point. It is now, and it is increasingly part of our mental grammar because we're used to the way the computers work. So suddenly evolution ceases to be such a real sort of problem to get hold of. I mean, it's rather like if you imagine the following scenario. Somebody is spotted in the street in London one day doing something. I mean, maybe it's a criminal investigation, and you've got a couple of detectives who are trying to work out how something happened. And one of them is a 20th century detective, and the other, by the marvels of science fiction, is a 19th century detective. And you give them the following problem. Somebody who is clearly seen and identified on the street in London on Tuesday was seen by somebody else, an equally reliable witness, on the street in Santa Fe on Tuesday. How could that possibly, I mean, the 19th century detective would say, how could that possibly be? And the only thing he could think of is some sort of magical intervention. Now, the 20th century detective may not be able to say, well, it was BA flight this, and it was then United flight that. I mean, he may not be able to figure out exactly which way he did it, or which route he came, but it's not a mystery. Yeah, it doesn't bother us. And we would say, well, yeah, he got there by plane. I don't know which plane, and it might be a little bit tricky to find out which. But there's no essential mystery because we're used to the idea of jet travel. So I suspect that as we become more and more conversant, more and more people become more and more conversant with the role the computer plays, and the way in which the computer models the process of enormously simple processes giving rise to enormously complex results. The idea of life being an emergent phenomenon will become easier and easier to swallow. It just isn't a particular. We may not know. We may never know precisely what steps life took in the very, very early stages of this planet. But it's not a mystery. You know, we know it would have been. We don't know whether it was BA 178 or 278 or whatever, but we know roughly how it was done. So, what we've arrived at here, and though the first sort of shockwave of this arrival was in 1859, is really the arrival of the computers kind of demonstrated it, kind of unarguably to us, is that we live in a universe that is not designed from the top downwards, but from the bottom upwards. Complexity emerges from lower levels of simplicity. I've never understood anyway. I mean, this has always struck me as being bizarre that the idea of a God as a creator was sufficient explanation for the complexities here around us, because it simply doesn't explain where he came from. And if we imagine that a designer implies design, and therefore each thing he designs or causes to be designed, is a level simpler than him or her, then you have to ask, what is the level above that? And so this is one peculiar model of the universe. We have turtles all the way down. Here we have gods all the way up. It really isn't a very good answer. But on the other hand, a bottom-up solution, which rests on the incredibly powerful tautology of anything that happens, clearly gives you a very, very simple and powerful answer that needs no other explanation whatsoever. But here's the interesting thing. Now, I said I wanted to say, is there a virtual God? Is there an artificial God? And this is where I also address the question of why the idea of a God is so pervasive. Now, I've already explained where the kind of illusion I feel comes from in the first place. And it comes from a sort of falseness in our perspective. Because we're not taking into account the fact that we are evolved beings. We've evolved into a particular landscape, evolved into a particular environment with a particular set of skills and views of the world that have enabled us to survive rather successfully and to thrive in this environment. But it seems to be even more powerful an idea than that. And my feeling, and this is the idea I want to propose, which is that the spot at the top of the pyramid that we previously said was whence everything flowed, merely because we say it doesn't flow that way, doesn't mean to say that there isn't something, there isn't a sort of, that there's an actual vacancy there. Now let me explain what I mean by this. We have created in the world in which we live, all sorts of things. We have changed our world in all kinds of ways. I mean, that's very, very clear. We've built the room we're in. We've built all this complex stuff, a few examples. But we've also constructed all kinds of fictitious entities that are enormously powerful in our world. God is clearly, I would suggest, a fictitious entity, and is clearly extremely powerful. Do we say, well, that's a bad idea, it's stupid, we should simply get rid of it? Well, here's another fictitious entity: money. Money is a completely fictitious entity. But it is very, very powerful in our world, because we each have wallets which have got notes in them. But what can those notes do? You can't breathe them, you can't stir-fry them, you can't live in them. There's absolutely nothing you can do with them that's any use other than exchange them with each other. And as soon as we exchange them with each other, all sorts of powerful things happen. Because it's a fiction that we all subscribe to. We don't think this is wrong or right or bad. The thing is, if money simply vanished, the entire sort of cooperative structure that we have would implode. But if we were all to vanish, money would vanish as well. Money has no meaning outside ourselves. It is something that we have created that has a powerful shaping effect in the world because it's something we all subscribe to. Now, I would love somebody to write a kind of evolutionary history of religion, because the way in which it has developed seems to me to be to show all kinds of evolutionary strategies. If you have a kind of arms race between one or two animals living in the same environment. Think of, for instance, the Amazonian manatee that lives off a particular type of reed, and the more of the reed it eats, the more the reed develops silica in its cells to attack the tooth of the manatee, and the manatee's tooth gets bigger and stronger, and after a while it learns to replace them. The thing this is very, very typical. One side does one thing, the next counters it, and so on. And as we know, throughout evolutionary history, arms races are things that drive evolution in the most powerful ways. Now, in the world of ideas, you can see kind of similar things happening. Now, since the invention of the scientific method, and science is, I'm sure we all agree, the most powerful intellectual idea, the most powerful framework for thinking and investigating and understanding and challenging the world around us that there is. And it rests on the idea that any idea is there to be attacked. And if it withstands the attack, then it lives to fight another day. If it doesn't withstand the attack, then down it goes. Religion kind of doesn't work like that. It has certain ideas at the heart of it, which we call sacred or holy, or whatever. Now this is, that's an idea we're all so familiar with, whether we subscribe to it or not, that it's kind of odd to think what it actually means. Because really what it means is, here is an idea or a notion that you're not allowed to say anything bad about. You're just not allowed to. Why not? Because you're not. Now, if somebody votes for a party that you don't agree with, you're free to argue it as much as you like with them. Everybody will have an argument, but nobody feels aggrieved by it. If somebody thinks the rate of tax should go up or go down, you're free to have an argument. No, it's stupid. No, it should go up, it should go down, whatever it is. I mean, nobody feels aggrieved by it. On the other hand, if somebody says, I'm not going to, I mustn't move a light switch on Saturday, you say, oh, fine. I respect that. Now, the odd thing is, even as I'm saying that, I'm thinking, oh my God, is there an Orthodox Jew here who's going to be offended by the fact that I just said that? But I wouldn't have thought before, well, maybe there's somebody from the left wing or somebody from the right wing or somebody who has subscribes to this view of economics or the other one who's making any of the other points. I would say, well, fine, we have different opinions. But the moment I say something that has something to do with somebody's, I'm going to sort of stick my neck out and say irrational beliefs, then we all become terribly defensive and terribly protective and say, no, we don't attack that. No, that's an irrational belief. No, we respect those. And it's rather like, if you imagine, if you think back in terms of sort of animal evolution, it's like an animal that's grown an incredible carapace around it, like a tortoise, that nothing can get through. And that's become a very, if you're a tortoise, that's a great survival strategy, because nothing can get through. And nothing, or maybe you're a poisonous fish, and nothing will come close to you. And therefore you thrive just by keeping away any challenges to what it is you are. And in the case of an idea, here is a challenge, so here is an idea that is protected by an idea which is holiness or sanctity. What does it mean? Why should it be that it's perfectly legitimate to support the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Republicans, or the Democrats, or whatever, or to support this model of economics versus that, to support Macintosh or Windows or whatever it is. But to have an opinion about how the universe began and who created the universe, no, that's holy. What does that mean? Why do we ring fence that for any other reason other than we've got used to ring fencing it? There's no other reason at all. It's just one of these things that sort of crept into sort of being, and once that loop gets going, it's very, very powerful. It's very powerful. So we are used to not challenging, except for religion, not challenging religious ideas. But it's very, very interesting how much of a furore Richard creates when he does it. I mean, everybody gets absolutely frantic about it because you're not allowed to say these things. And when you look at it rationally, there is no reason why it shouldn't be as open to debate as anything else, except that we have agreed somehow between us that it should not be. So I feel that there is a kind of evolutionary history of religion to be written. But going back to the idea of whether or not there is an artificial God, nevertheless it has a very powerful shaping effect. There's a very interesting book, I don't know if anybody here has read it, called Man on Earth, by an anthropologist who used to be at Cambridge called John Reader, which he describes the way that I'm going to back up a little bit and tell you about the whole book, which is it's a series of studies of different cultures in the world that have developed within somewhat isolated circumstances, either on an island or in a mountain valley or whatever, so that it's possible to treat them to a certain extent as kind of test tube case and see, therefore, exactly the degree to which their environment and their immediate circumstances have affected the way in which their culture has arisen. It's a fascinating series of studies. But the one I have in mind at the moment is the one which describes the culture and economy of Bali, which is a small, very, very crowded island, which subsists on rice. And rice is an incredibly efficient food in that you can grow an awful lot of it in a relatively small space, but it's hugely labour intensive and requires an enormous, not only is it very labour intensive, it requires an awful lot of very, very precise cooperation amongst the people, particularly when you have this large population on a small island needing to bring this harvest in. And people looking now at the way in which the rice agriculture works in Bali, I'm kind of rather sort of puzzled by it because it is intensely religious. The society of Bali is intensely religion permeates every single aspect of it, and everybody in that culture is kind of very, very carefully defined in terms of who they are, what their status is, what their role in life is, and it's all defined by the church. And they have very peculiar calendars, and they have very peculiar sort of customs and rituals, and it's all very precisely defined. And oddly enough, they are fantastically good at being very, very productive with their rice harvest. Now, people came in the 70s and noticed that that the rice harvest is determined by the temple calendar, and it seemed to be completely nonsensical. So look, get rid of all this. Look, we can make your rice harvest much, much more productive, even than your very successful income. Use these pesticides, use this calendar, use this and the other. And so they started. And in 2 or 3 years, the rice production went up enormously. But the whole predator-prey pest balance went completely out of kilter, and very shortly the rice plummeted again. So they said, screw it, we're going back to the temple calendar. And they reinstated what was there before, and it all worked again. It worked absolutely perfectly. And it's all very well to say, yes, but that's basing all that on something as irrational and meaningless as a religion is stupid. They should be able to work it out more logically than that. But I mean, you might just as well say to us, well, all right, our money, our cultural society works on the basis of money, and that's a fiction. So why don't we get rid of it and just cooperate with each other normally? It's not going to work. So there is a sense in which we build meta-systems above ourselves to fill in that space that we actually previously populated with an entity that was supposed to be the intentional designer, the creator. And even though there isn't one, because we, I don't necessarily mean we in this room, but we as a species, imagine and create one, and then allow ourselves to behave as if there was one, all sorts of things begin to happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. So what I'm attempting to say is that there are a lot of irrational things that we see around us, that because the explanation that is offered for them doesn't work or is wrong, shouldn't allow us then to say or to believe that therefore there's nothing to it whatsoever. The whole thing doesn't exist. Let me try and illustrate this, what I mean by something else. This is very speculative. I'm really sort of going out on a limb here because it's something I know nothing about whatsoever. So I think of this more as a thought experiment than a real explanation of something. But I want to talk about Feng Shui. I don't know Feng Shui or Feng Shui. I think it's called Feng Shui, which is something I know very little about, but there's been a lot about it recently. But in order to figure out how a building should be designed, built, situated, and decorated, and so on, you need to think about it being inhabited by dragons. And you have to look at it in terms of how a dragon would move around here. And if a dragon wouldn't be happy in this house, you have to put a red fish bowl here, or put a window there, or move, or whatever it is. And this sounds like complete and utter nonsense. Because anything that's involving dragons must be nonsense, because there ain't any dragons. So any theory based on how dragons behave is nonsense. So what are these silly people doing, sort of imagining that dragons can tell you how to build your house? So, nevertheless, it occurs to me that there is, if you disregard for a moment the explanation that's actually offered for it. And maybe there is something interesting going on. It kind of goes like this. Trying to build, we all know, from all the buildings we've lived in, or worked in, or been in, or stayed in, or whatever, that some are more comfortable and more pleasant and more agreeable to live in than others. We have no real way of sort of quantifying this, but in this century we've had an awful lot of architects who think they know how to do it. And we've had this sort of horrible idea that houses are a machine for living in. And we've had sort of look at Bourdieu and Mies van der Rohe and so on, sort of putting up glass stumps or sort of strange-shaped things that are supposed to form some theory or other, and it's all engineered and sort of worked out in all sorts of complex ways, but nevertheless, I mean, they're actually not very nice to live in. But there's an awful lot of theory that has been poured into them. Now, I mean, if you sit and work with an architect, and I've been through that stressful times, I'm sure a lot of people have, then when you're trying to figure out how a room should work, you're trying to integrate all kinds of things about lighting, about angles, and about how people move and how people live, and an awful lot of it. You don't know what you're leaving out, you don't know what importance to attach to one thing or another. You're trying very consciously to figure out something where you haven't really got much of a clue, and there's this theory and this bit of engineering practice and that bit of architectural practice, and you don't really know what to make of it. Let me compare that to somebody who tosses a cricket ball at you. Now you can sit and watch it and say, well, it's going at 17 degrees at such, and you can sort of start to work it out on paper, do a bit of calculus and so on. And about a week after the ball whizzed past you, you may have figured out, where it's going to be and how to catch it. Or on the other hand, you can simply put your hand out, because we have all kinds of faculties built into us kind of just below the conscious level. We're able to do all kinds of complex integrations of all kinds of complex phenomena and enable us to say, oh, there's a ball coming, catch it. And what I want to suggest is that Feng Shui and an awful lot of things are precisely of that kind. Sorry, the thought just flipped past me. Just try to catch it. I may need to reboot. It's gone. Yes, I know what it was. Yeah, sorry. I was trying to remember whose book this was in the other day. Somebody presented a problem in two different ways. First of all, presented a logical problem, expressed in pure terms of logic, that was actually quite hard to figure out, and you sort of have to sit there scratching your head and sucking your pencil for a bit to figure it out. And then presented another problem, which was simply a story of a couple of people going to a village, and the chief says, if you do this, I'll let you go, and if you don't do that, I'll do this, I'll do the other. And you have to figure out what the traveller says. The point is very obvious. And then he points out that but exactly the same problem. But that we are social animals, and that we are used to dealing with other social animals. So the business of who you trust, who you don't trust, what deals you make, all come absolutely second nature to us. It's very simple and straightforward, but express the same problem in algebraic terms, and you have to sort of pause and think about it quite hard. So there are all sorts of things we know how to do, but don't necessarily know that we know how to do. We just do them. So go back to the issue of how you figure out how a room or a house should be designed. And instead of sort of going through all the business of sort of trying to sort of work out the angles and trying to divest what genuine architectural principles may be, you may want to take out of what is currently an architectural fad. instead of doing all that, just think, well, how would a dragon live here? Because we're used to thinking of organic creatures. An organic creature involves an enormous complexity of all sorts of different variables that is beyond our ability to resolve unless we think of it in terms of an organic creature. Because we know how organic creatures live. We've never seen a dragon, but we've all got an idea about what a dragon's like. So if you see, well, if a dragon went through here, he'd get stuck here and get a bit cross there because he couldn't see that, and he would just have to wave his tail there and knock that vase over. So you say, okay, well, let's figure out how the dragon was going to be happy here. And you figure that out, and then lo and behold, you've suddenly got a place that makes sense for other organic creatures such as ourselves to live in. So, my argument is that as we become more and more scientifically literate, it's worth remembering that the fictions we previously inhabited our world with may have some function that it's worth trying to understand and trying to preserve the essential components of, rather than throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Because even though we may not accept the reasons, the given reasons for them being there in the first place, it may well be that there are other reasons, there are good practical reasons for them or something like them to be there. And I suspect as we move further and further into the field of digital or artificial life, we will find more and more that unexpected, well, we already know that unexpected emergent properties begin to emerge out of what we see happening there, and that that is a precise parallel to the entities we create around ourselves to inform and shape our lives and enable us to work and live together. So therefore I would argue that though there isn't an actual God, there is an artificial God, and we should probably bear that in mind. So that is my debating point. And you're now free to start hurling the chairs around.
What's the fourth error?
Okay, yes.
That was my question.
Okay, yeah, good point. Right, okay, this will be another 10 minutes or so.
Drink.
Okay. Let me back up away from it and talk about the way in which we communicate. Traditionally, we have a bunch of different ways to communicate with each other. One is one-to-one, we talk to each other, have a conversation. One is one-to-many, which is what I'm doing, right? I'm talking to all of you guys. Or you have somebody standing up singing a song or saying, we've got to go to war. All of these things are one-to-many communications. Then we have many-to-one communications. We have a kind of sort of pretty patchy, clunky, not very well working version of we call democracy. But in a more primitive state is, I just sort of said, okay, we're going to go to war, and everybody says, no, we're not. And then you have the argument that breaks out afterwards as everyone starts to sort of exchange ideas between themselves about what we're doing at this point, which we have many-to-many communications. Now, in this century, well, I sort of going back on to the previous century as well, we've modelled three of those technologically. We've modelled one-to-one communications with telephone, which we are extremely familiar with. We have one-to-many communications. Boy, do we have a lot of that. We have an awful lot of one-to-many communications. A whole sort of, broadcasting, publishing, journalism. We get information poured at us from all over the place. And it's completely indiscriminate where it lands. It's very curious when you think that you don't have to go very far back in our history, and all the information that reached us was relevant to us. And therefore, anything that happens, any news, whether it's about something that's actually happened to us, or something that's happened in the next house or the next village, or within the boundary of our horizon, it's happened in our world. And if you react to it, the world reacts back to your reaction. It's all relevant to us. So somebody has a terrible accident, you all crowd around and help. Nowadays, and because of the plethora of one-to-many communications we have, you have somebody's had a terrible accident, a plane has crashed in India. Oh my God! And you get terribly sort of anxious about it. But your anxiety doesn't lead to anything at all. It just sort of pours away into the world and nothing happens as a consequence. So we have become tremendously anxious about all sorts of things that traditionally are relevant to us, so we feel them, but that relevance doesn't have any impact. And we're not very well able to distinguish between some terrible emergency that's happened to somebody half a world away, and something's happened to somebody around. We can't really distinguish between them anymore, which is why we get terribly upset about something that's happened to somebody in a soap opera that comes out of Hollywood, and maybe less concerned when it's happened to our sister. So we've all got kind of really sort of twisted and disconnected, and it's not surprised that we all feel very sort of stressed and alienated in the world we find, because the world impacts us and we don't impact the world.
Okay, so the fourth Arab stands south of the beach.
Now you've thrown me. Okay, and then so we have then many to one. We have that. We don't have it very well yet. And there's not much of it about. But essentially, our democratic systems are kind of modelled out, and they're not very good. But I think they will improve dramatically. We can come on to that in a second. But the fourth, the many to many, we didn't have at all. And what becoming of the internet? And the internet, of course, runs on fibre optic. Now the backbone is fibre optic, and gradually we'll get fibre. I think what?
CPUs are going copper.
Okay, all right. But essentially, what I was it's communications between us that is the sort of fourth age. And this thing about the world not reacting to us when we react to it. I remember the first moment at which I began to kind of take the internet seriously a few years ago. It was a very, very silly thing. It was just very there's a story about a guy who was a computer research student at Carnegie Mellon. And he used to like, I think it was Dr. Pepper Light. And there was a drinks machine a couple of stories away from him. So he used to sort of regularly go and get a Dr. Pepper, but because it was rather odd drink, it was out of stock at that. And so he'd have quite a few wasted journeys. So he eventually figured out, hang on, well there's a chip in there. And I'm on a computer, there's a network running around the computer, so why don't I just put the Coca-Cola machine on the network? And so I can just poll it from my terminal whenever I want to. So I can tell whether I'm going to have a wasted journey or not. So we connected the Coca-Cola machine to the net. And the local net, but the local net is also part of the internet. So suddenly, anybody in the world can see what's happening in the Coca-Cola machine. Now, that may not be vital information, but it turned out to be curiously fascinating. And everybody kind of wanted to know what was happening in the Coca-Cola machine. And it started to develop a bit, because in the chip, it doesn't just say, well, this slot which happens to have the Dr. Pepper lights in is empty, or but it's got all sorts of information. It says, okay, well, there are 7 Cokes and 3 Diet Cokes, and the temperature, they're all stored as this. The last time they were loaded was this, or the other. There's a lot of information in there. And there's one really fabulous piece of information. It turns out if somebody has put their 50 cents in and hasn't pressed the button, i.e. if the machine is pregnant, then you can, from your computer terminal, wherever you are in the world, if you log onto that Coca-Cola machine, you can drop that can. So, somebody be walking down the corridor, it's like bang, Now, what caused that? Oh, very obviously, somebody 5,000 miles away in a computer. I mean, it's clear. But now this is a very, very sort of silly, but sort of wonderfully fascinating thing. And what it said to me is that this is the first time that we can reach back into the world. I mean, it may not be terribly important that from 5,000 miles away you can reach into a university corridor and drop a Coca-Cola can. But it's kind of the first shot. It's the first shot in the war of bringing to us a whole new way of communicating and taking the model of the small village and making the whole world work like a small village. So that, I think, is the fourth age of sound.
This podcast is covered by Creative Commons. If you use this podcast either in audio or text form, please include a link back to biota.org as the source of this podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and if you're interested in more artificial life-related stuff, please subscribe to the biota.org mailing list. Thank you very much for tuning into this podcast. Look forward to you tuning into the next podcast.